Well, guys, we have made it to Scream 4, the last film in this franchise directed by the legendary Wes Craven. And it takes place 10 years later as Sidney Prescott is finally finding some peace in her life, having written a book and revisiting her hometown of Woodsboro on a tour. But as soon as she appears, Ghostface returns from the shadows to begin another killing spree. Even though I thought that Scream 3 was an alright film, it clearly showed that this franchise needed a sense of revitalization. It needed something fresh. It needed to feel like the roots of Scream again. Like I said, this was the last film that Wes Craven directed before he deceased, and as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, he went out with a bang. This film I've always liked, but I now kind of love. Just from the opening scene, you can tell that the meta edge is back in full. And I remember the first time I saw Scream 4, it was sometime after I saw the entirety of the Saw franchise, leading up to Spiral that came out in 2021. Outside of the first one, I didn't like any of them. But yet they were just these films that made a lot of money and they had some sort of fan base. But what I loved about the opening scene is this small moment where these two girls are talking about what movie they're going to watch. And one of them mentions that they're going to watch a Saw film. And the other one has the perfect reaction to that statement.
We're going to go scary. Saw 4.
Ugh, I saw that in theaters. It sucks. It's not scary. It's gross. I hate all that torture porn shit.
Well, I like Jigsaw. I think he kills people very creatively.
But you don't give a shit who dies because there's no character development. There's just body parts ripping and blood spewing. Ugh.
I was so glad when I heard that. I was like, yes, Wes Craven, you understand me. You understand what I feel. Of all the openings of all the Scream films, this is my favorite so far. And I can see how it can be a bit too much for some people. You know, the fact that the whole scene is a film inside a film inside a film. Because how it starts out, it's the opening of Stab 6, inside the opening of Stab 7, and some people in actual Woodsboro are watching that. It's meta on an Inception level of insanity. And for being this long-awaited sequel, because Scream 3 came out in the year 2000 and Scream 4 came out in 2011, it doesn't feel dated. It still feels like it's up to date with current horror. And it's talking about like found footage and how those types of movies were some big money makers for the horror genre at that time. This character is talking about how horror movies at that time are more about like subversion, just going in these crazy directions that the audience can't expect, and there's more violence, more carnage candy. And these characters just basically mention exactly what you're thinking. It just goes back to what Scream is. Like I said, Scream 3, for as perfectly enjoyable as that film still is, it just didn't feel like Scream. And this film really put the franchise back on course. I also appreciate how the opening of this film wasn't rehashing the opening of a previous film. One of my main complaints with Scream 3 was that it kind of rehashed the whole thing between Dewey and Gale, and also the fact that Sidney was once again this distant person. But here it gives a believable update on these characters. And speaking about Dewey and Gale, there's a character that I'm actually surprised this hasn't happened in the franchise so far, at least from what I've seen. I might be missing something, but it's the first time that I've heard of this, that there's finally been a character that's mentioned how kind of awkward that romance is.
How long have you and Dewey been married?
10 years.
Oh, just like your characters in Stab 3. Wow. Wow. I didn't mean bad wow. It always seemed like more of a movie romance than a real one, because it was a movie, and in real life you two'd never be. Ooh.
But when you go to Sydney, she's finally just not hiding anymore. She's decided she doesn't want to be the victim anymore, and she wants to take her experiences and have herself become a stronger person. And with that, you get this experienced version of this character that knows exactly what to do during moments of tension. And I just liked seeing how this character progressed throughout this franchise that was very uncommon for horror films, because horror films are built in a way that the characters need to be dumb. But that's not the case with Sydney. And also something I mentioned with Scream 3, I know probably a lot of comparisons I'm going to make to that film, but that now Sydney is kind of the perfect person to help others that are in similar situations that she was in. But here you get this plot point that is more personal, where you get the introduction of her cousin Jill, and it grows into this surprisingly compelling plot point where she sees herself in Jill and wants to protect her. At this point, she's not just another ghost-faced victim, that now she has this edge of her character where she's becoming a protector. And much more so than the other films, her being willing to put her life on the line if it means saving someone else. In this film taking place many years later as it is, all that just makes sense for this character at this point. And like I mentioned, this film is pretty gritty. There's a lot of carnage, a lot of blood, and at a lot of points you feel people getting hit against objects and stabbed and whatnot. And it just added for a more realistic film. And also the fact that this film keeps its scenes fresh by not always being clear where they're going to go. Like when Jill and her friend are in a house and they get a call from Ghostface and he's saying that he's in the closet, but really he's in the closet in another house. And then he starts killing that other person. One of the themes of this movie is clearly remakes, and it also plays with familiar scenes, like the scene when Sydney walks in on Jill and her boyfriend, and it both serves as Sydney seeing herself in Jill, remembering when Billy Loomis would climb up to her room and she would have to hide him from her father, but it also serves as a snapshot of what it would look like if that scene was recreated. But what makes this film for me is that it has my favorite plot twist of the franchise, and in that, my favorite killer in Jill. And it calls back to something that Stu said in the first Scream in regards to a woman being the killer.
They didn't ask me if I liked that.
It's because there's no way a girl could have killed him. Yeah, Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
And sure, we got Mrs. Loomis in Scream 2, but she just had a gun and she was out for revenge, and I don't know, that was pretty much it. I was neutral on that character. But here, this girl is ruthless and really determined. Like when she's trying to create this story that she's the sole survivor of this massacre, but then she just has to kind of injure herself by knocking herself against objects in this house and stabbing herself in the chest. And it's this character that is very hardcore, kind of badass, for all the while that we've had male killers in this franchise. And even though we had Mrs. Loomis and that was the first lady killer, this was the first legitimate time we got a great female slasher inside the Scream franchise. And part of the fun for me rewatching this film was having that twist in mind and looking at different scenes with her with that context. And I was pleased to see that the film is clever and it hides that twist really well. And in particular, it hides itself really well in this relationship that she has with Sydney. Because going back to the way that this film plays with reboots, we just see Jill being set up as the next Sydney, the next character that we're going to follow throughout the rest of this franchise. But then we get this jealous reveal from her.
Do you know what it was like growing up in this family?
Related to you? You were always just so fucking special!
In a sense, she's like the bad version of Sydney. What Sydney would have been if she took the idea of being the victim to the way extreme. And I would say that this was the first time in the series that Sydney really had to face herself. And I'm not gonna lie, the ending of this movie is kind of like a metaphor. Because her goal at the beginning, like I said, is to not be the victim anymore. But throughout the movie, she keeps being put in situations where she's being asked to be the victim. Her facing Jill is her facing the fact that being the victim really isn't going to help her. But it was just some clever writing. I will say, though, that outside of Jill, the other teens, the stuff going on with them, it was less interesting. I would say that this film was definitely the precursor to Scream 5, where I think Scream 5 had a better idea of moving away a bit from the legacy characters to have new characters grow in their place. And this film didn't quite figure that out yet. It still needed those connections to characters like Sydney, Dewey, and Gale. And at times the situations going on with them, it's just kind of awkward teen stuff. But in the end, Scream 4 is one of those movies that I remember that being good. I don't remember it being great. And like Scream 2, there's a group of people out there that doesn't like this film. And I think if you're a part of that group, just give it another try. You know, especially if it's been a while. Just give it another try. There's definitely things to appreciate here. And for me, Scream 4 is one of the most rewatchable of the bunch. I'm going to give it an A-. Except for Scream 3, all these films have just been great. So stay tuned for my review of Scream 5, the latest installment in this franchise before Scream 6, and I'll see you then.